Number 8. John Giles. In 1935, a 34-year-old mail robber named John Giles arrived at Alcatraz and was assigned to the dock crew, the team responsible for unloading supply boats that serviced the island. It was considered one of the better work assignments on the Rock: fresh air, a view of the bay, and, as it turned out, a decade-long opportunity that no one in the Bureau of Prisons had anticipated. The US Army ran regular laundry runs between military installations in the Bay Area. Every week, wooden crates of military clothing passed through the Alcatraz dock. Every week, John Giles was there when they arrived. He never took anything large enough to notice. Over the course of nearly 10 years, from approximately 1935 to 1945, Giles accumulated one complete United States Army Staff Sergeant's uniform, stolen one piece at a time: a sleeve, a button, an insignia. Historians who later reviewed the case noted that no single theft would have registered as suspicious. The accumulation of all of them was extraordinary. On July 31st, 1945, Giles put the uniform on beneath his prison clothes, stripped off the outer layer near the dock, and walked calmly aboard the Army transport vessel General Cox as it prepared to depart. He made it off the island. He had solved every part of the problem except one. The General Cox was not heading to San Francisco. It was heading to Angel Island, another military installation 2 miles north. By the time Giles realized where he was being taken, Alcatraz guards had already noticed his absence. A pursuit boat was already in the water. He was arrested on Angel Island before he could take a single step toward the mainland. 10 years of patience. A perfect plan. The wrong boat. Giles was brought back to Alcatraz, and his sentence was extended. He was released in 1961. He never attempted another escape. He never explained, publicly, how close he believed he came. Number 7. The Battle of Alcatraz, May 2nd to May 4th, 1946. What began as an escape attempt ended as a siege, and what caused it to collapse into something catastrophic was a single missing key. On the morning of May 2nd, 1946, an inmate named Bernard Coy had himself in position inside the cell house gun gallery, the elevated steel cage from which armed officers monitored the block. Coy had spent months studying the gallery's construction. He had identified a weakness in the bar spacing at one section of the cage and had been systematically bending those bars with a makeshift tool over a period of weeks. On May 2nd, they were wide enough. He squeezed through. He took the armed officer inside by surprise. Within minutes, the group he had assembled, Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Moran Thompson, and 18-year-old Clarence Carnes, had the weapons, had the cell house, and had what they believed were the necessary keys to reach the recreation yard, and from there, the bay. The key to Corridor D, the isolation block, was not where it was supposed to be. A guard, following standard procedure, had locked the key inside a cell while escorting an inmate. It was a routine act that nobody had flagged as a security protocol. It was also the act that brought the plan to a stop. Without that corridor, the route to the water was sealed. What followed over the next 39 hours resulted in 2 guards killed, 8 guards wounded, and 3 inmates dead. Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer were found shot in a utility corridor. The Marines had been called in. An estimated 200 rounds were fired into the cell block. When federal investigators later reviewed the event, they described it as the most violent incident in the institution's history. Shockley and Thompson were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin on December 3, 1948. Clarence Carnes, who had refused to fire on the wounded guards and who, at 18, was the youngest inmate ever admitted to Alcatraz, had his death sentence commuted. He served decades more and was eventually released in 1973. He died homeless in 1988, at 61 years old. There was no system in place to help him transition back into the world. One missing key, 2 guards dead. And the question that lingers, if the Bureau of Prisons had reviewed that corridor key protocol before May 2nd, and they had been warned that key control on that block was inconsistent, would any of it have happened? Number 6. Alvin Karpis FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called him public enemy number 1. He announced the arrest personally, staged for photographers, and took credit for the takedown. Alvin Creepy Karpis later said that Hoover hadn't known how to put the handcuffs on. Karpis, born Albin Karpowicz in Montreal in 1907, had been one of the most methodical bank robbers and kidnappers in the country during the Depression era. He and the Barker gang were responsible for kidnappings that netted over $300,000 in ransom in 1933 alone, equivalent to roughly $7 million today. He was organized in a way that set him apart from the theatrical criminals of his era. He planned exits the way other men planned entrances. He was 28 years old when Hoover's men arrested him on a street in New Orleans in May of 1936. He arrived at Alcatraz and spent 26 years there, longer than any other inmate in the island's operational history. 26 years. He watched inmates arrive and leave. He watched the prison itself change around him. He gave guitar lessons to a young Charles Manson, who was incarcerated at McNeil Island near the end of Karpis's sentence. Manson later credited Karpis as someone who had taken him seriously. Karpis was released in 1962, deported to Canada as a condition of his release, and eventually resettled in Spain. He wrote a memoir, Public Enemy Number 1, and gave interviews for years. He died in his sleep in Torremolinos, Spain, on August 26, 1979. He was 71 years old. He survived Alcatraz the only way a man with a life sentence can. He waited longer than the prison did. Number 5. Robert Stroud, the Birdman. The name Birdman of Alcatraz is one of the most successful pieces of myth-making in American criminal history. The 1962 film starring Burt Lancaster presented a man of sensitivity and scientific genius, wrongly confined, finding redemption through birds. The actual record is more complicated, and what the film omitted is the part you need to know. Robert Stroud killed a bartender in Alaska in 1909 at the age of 19. In 1916, while serving time at Leavenworth, he stabbed a prison guard to death in the dining hall in front of approximately 1,200 other inmates. The guard had reportedly had a dispute with a friend of Stroud's. Stroud was convicted and sentenced to hang. His mother, Elizabeth, conducted a personal lobbying campaign that eventually reached President Woodrow Wilson's wife, Edith Wilson, who then intervened. Wilson commuted the sentence to life in solitary confinement. While at Leavenworth, Stroud was permitted to keep birds in his cell. A policy eventually extended to an entire adjoining cell that was converted into what amounted to a private laboratory. He published 2 genuine reference works on avian diseases that were used by professionals in the field. He was also, according to prison records, simultaneously operating an illegal alcohol still. He married a woman he had corresponded with, Della Mae Jones, while incarcerated. Investigators later documented that the relationship had become controlling and coercive on his part. He was transferred to Alcatraz in 1942. He was not permitted to keep birds there. The official reasoning was that the bird operation at Leavenworth had grown unmanageable. The internal reasoning, documented in Bureau of Prisons communications, was that Stroud's influence over other inmates had become a security concern. He had spent years cultivating a network that extended beyond what the institution could monitor. He spent 11 years at Alcatraz, then was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He died there on November 21, 1963. He was 73 years old. He had been incarcerated for 54 years, his entire adult life. The film that romanticized his story was released in 1962, the year before he died. He never watched it. Whether he was told it existed is not recorded. Number 4. Whitey Bulger, James Joseph Bulger Jr., arrived at Alcatraz on November 16, 1959, convicted of bank robbery and truck hijacking. He was 29 years old. He later said it was the best prison he had ever been in. He had served time in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary before Alcatraz. Atlanta was brutal, overcrowded, and run in practice by the most powerful inmates. Alcatraz was different. Smaller population, stricter staff, better food by relative measure. The guards couldn't be bribed, which meant nobody else was running anything either. Bulger found the power structure honest in a way that he respected. What no one on that island could have known was what he was building in his mind for when he got out. Bulger was transferred from Alcatraz before the prison closed and was eventually released in 1965. Within 4 years, he had taken effective control of the Winter Hill Gang in South Boston. Within a decade, he had entered into an arrangement with the FBI's Boston field office that allowed his organization to operate with near-total legal immunity. The agent handling him, John Connolly, was eventually convicted of racketeering and second-degree murder. The supervisor above Connolly, John Morris, accepted cash bribes from Bulger and leaked the names of federal informants, at least one of whom was subsequently murdered. The FBI was not protecting a low-level source. They were running cover for a man responsible for a documented 11 to 19 murders, millions in extortion, and the systematic corruption of an entire field office over 16 years. When investigators finally began to dismantle the relationship in the mid-1990s, Bulger was tipped off by Connolly and fled. He went to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He spent 16 years as a fugitive, living in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California, under a false identity, with his long-term companion Catherine Gregg. He was arrested on June 22, 2011, at the age of 81. He was convicted by a federal jury in 2013 of 11 murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and racketeering. U.S. District Judge Denise Casper sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. On October 30, 2018, at approximately 8:15 in the morning, Bulger was beaten to death in his cell at USP Hazleton in West Virginia. Reportedly within hours of arriving at the facility, he was 89 years old. 3 men were charged. The killing took less than 15 minutes. The man who called Alcatraz his best prison experience died on his first morning in his last one. Was that justice or just the closest thing to it? Number 3. Alan West, the architect. The plan was Alan West's, all of it. West had arrived at Alcatraz in 1957 and, according to later interviews, had begun thinking about escape almost immediately. What he identified, after months of study, was that the ventilation system running above the cells in B and C blocks was accessible from the top of the cell house, and that the grill covering each cell's rear vent had been corroding from years of salt air exposure. With enough time and the right improvised tools, the grills could be removed entirely. He recruited Frank Morris, a man he recognized as someone with the specific kind of intelligence the plan required. Morris recruited the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, from Georgia. Over the following months, working only at night, they carved into the concrete behind their cells using improvised bits fashioned from spoons sharpened against cell floors. They assembled a raft from more than 50 raincoats stolen from other inmates, stitching them together with thread pulled from prison-issue clothing. They built an inflatable from rubber cement. They constructed decoy heads from papier-mâché and plaster, flesh-colored, painted, fitted with real human hair collected from the prison barbershop, and placed them in their beds so that the evening flashlight count would show 4 sleeping men instead of 4 empty spaces. Prison logs showed that a guard conducting a night check on June 11th saw what appeared to be Clarence Anglin asleep in his bunk and moved on. On the night of June 11th, 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers climbed through their widened vents, crossed the rooftop, descended the drain pipe on the northeast corner of the building, and reached the water. Alan West did not. His vent hadn't been widened enough. He had fallen behind on the grinding. He worked at the concrete for over an hour, frantic by all accounts, and eventually widened it enough to get through. He made it to the rooftop. He looked at the bay. The others were gone. He went back down to his cell and got into bed. The next morning, when the escape was discovered, when guards found 3 empty beds and 3 papier-mâché heads staring up from the pillows, Alan West told investigators everything: the route, the tools, the raft, the timeline. He cooperated in exchange for consideration on future charges. He was never charged for the escape itself. He completed his sentence, was released, robbed a store, and was returned to prison. He died of a perforated ulcer on December 21, 1978, in a Florida correctional facility. He built the most sophisticated escape in Alcatraz history. He was the only one of the 4 who didn't use it. Number 2. John and Clarence Anglin. John William Anglin was born on May 2, 1930, in Donaldsonville, Georgia. Clarence Anglin was born on May 11, 1931. They were the 6th and 7th of 13 children born to George and Rachel Anglin, a family that traveled seasonally for farm work across Florida and Georgia. They had almost nothing growing up. What they did have was the water. The family lived near enough to rivers, lakes, and open bays that swimming was simply part of childhood. People who knew them in their early years later told investigators that both John and Clarence were strong open water swimmers. This detail, at the time, appeared to be context. It would become central to every debate about what happened after June 11th. Both brothers had records by their early 20s. Both had escaped from other facilities. They broke out of Florida State Prison in Rayford and were recaptured. They were sent to Alcatraz in 1960 specifically because they were designated as escape risks. They were assigned cells adjacent to Frank Morris. The plan made sense to them from the moment Morris laid it out. John's cell was B150. Clarence's was B152. They worked on the vents every night during the 1-hour accordion music period, the sound of scraping masked by the noise that the institution officially permitted. Their papier-mâché heads were, by all accounts, the most convincing of the 3. The one found in Clarence's cell had been painted with flesh-toned watercolor, fitted with closely matched hair, and posed at an angle that fooled a guard conducting a flashlight sweep from the corridor. On the night of June 11, 1962, they went. The following morning, investigators found a wooden paddle and personal items belonging to the Anglins washed up on Angel Island. A homemade life preserver was recovered near the Golden Gate. No bodies were ever recovered. The FBI ran the investigation from 1962 to 1979. They concluded, without physical evidence of survival, that the men had most likely drowned. Then, in 2013, a team of researchers at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands ran a hydrodynamic reconstruction of the escape using tidal and current data from June 11 to June 12, 1962. Their model, built from the same oceanographic data, the Coast Guard uses for search and rescue operations indicated that if the raft had launched between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, the specific current pattern that night would have pushed them not out toward the open ocean, but north, toward the Marin Headlands on the mainland. The research team noted that this current configuration occurred on only a small number of nights per year. June 11, 1962, was one of them. In December of 2015, the U.S. Marshal Service disclosed that they had received a letter postmarked in 2013, allegedly written by John Anglin. The letter stated that both brothers had survived, that Clarence had died of cancer in 2011, that John himself was in poor health, that he was 83 years old and willing to turn himself in if the government would agree to provide medical treatment in exchange for a 1-year sentence. Handwriting analysis of the letter was inconclusive. A photograph included with the letter allegedly showing John and Clarence Anglin in Brazil in 1975 was similarly inconclusive. The marshals never confirmed the letter as genuine. They never dismissed it either. The case remains officially open. John Anglin, if the letter is real and if its claims are accurate, would be 95 years old today. Number 1. Frank Morris. Frank Lee Morris was born in Washington, D.C. on September 1st, 1926. He was placed in foster care as an infant. He had no known biological family who claimed him, no siblings, no one. By the time he was 13 years old, he had already been arrested. By his early 20s, he was cycling through federal institutions with a consistency that the Bureau of Prisons recorded but never fully interrogated. He had escaped from other facilities before Alcatraz. He had been designated a high escape risk at every institution he'd passed through. He was also, by measured assessment, extraordinarily intelligent. IQ testing conducted during his federal incarceration placed him at 133, a score that falls in the top 2% of the population. He arrived at Alcatraz on January 20th, 1960, and was assigned to Cell B-138. What he built over the next 2 years and 5 months was not simply an escape plan. It was a systematic engineering project conducted under total surveillance, in a facility designed by people who believed it to be inescapable, using materials that the institution itself provided. The ventilation insight was West's, but the technical execution, the improvised concrete bits, the timing of the work to align with the music hour, the structural analysis of which drainpipe could hold weight, the construction of a functional inflatable raft from 50-plus raincoats with a working inflation mechanism. That was Morris. Prison staff later told investigators that Morris had never given them any reason to increase their scrutiny of him. He was calm. He followed rules. He filed no grievances. He asked for nothing unusual. He had been, by every observable measure, a model inmate. The FBI investigation that followed the escape ran for 17 years. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They reviewed every piece of physical evidence. They issued wanted circulars. They traced reported sightings, men who looked like Morris or the Anglins turning up in South America, in Mexico, in Europe, and investigated dozens of them. None were confirmed. They concluded that Morris and the Anglin brothers had almost certainly drowned. In 2011, 49 years after the escape, the U.S. Marshal Service formally took over jurisdiction. They had developed new investigative tools, digital age progression technology, genealogical database access, updated forensic methods that the FBI had not had in 1979. In 2018, the marshals were revealed that their genealogical investigation had connected a DNA sample from Clarence Anglin's known relatives to evidence recovered from the escape route. The findings were not conclusive. They were enough to keep the case open. Frank Morris would be 98 years old today. The FBI spent 17 years investigating and decided he was dead. The marshals have spent more than a decade since with different tools, a different conclusion about the evidence, and a case they have not closed. One of them is wrong. The federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island closed on March 21, 1963, 9 months after the Morris Anglin escape. The official reason given was the cost of operating an island facility. It cost approximately 3 times more per inmate to run Alcatraz than any comparable mainland institution. In 1963 dollars, the per inmate annual cost was roughly $10 per day, more than double the federal average. The escape was never publicly cited as a reason for closure. What the escape did was crack something more important than a wall. For 29 years, Alcatraz had operated on a myth that getting off the island was impossible. That myth was not incidental to the facility's function. It was central to it. The belief that escape was impossible was part of what kept 1,576 inmates processed through those cells in something close to order. After June 12, 1962, that myth was gone. Whether the 3 men drowned or survived is, in a certain sense, secondary to the fact that they got off the island. Nobody could say it was impossible anymore. Not really. In 1972, Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It is now one of the most visited national park sites in the United States, drawing more than 1.4 million visitors per year. Cell B138, where Frank Morris lived and planned and waited, is open for viewing. There is no plaque. There is no note explaining what happened in that cell between January 1960 and June 1962. The cell is just a cell, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, steel toilet, steel bunk. And somewhere, in whatever archive holds the Morris Anglin case file, is a question that 62 years and 2 federal agencies have not answered. Did they make it?